ways to your seat. We're going to begin in a few minutes. Thanks. Excuse me, I'm not sure if he's aware. All right, good morning, everyone. If you could please start taking your seats, we're going to get started in just a few minutes. Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out here, and I'd like to welcome you all to the 32nd anniversary of Miami Book Fair International. My name is LaSelve Harrison, and I'm a volunteer room host, and I'll be in this room here with all of you here today. First of all, if you've looked through the schedule of events for today, you're going to see that there are many activities going on within this building, Children's Alley, the Swamp, the Porch. It's basically a full, fun-filled day, many activities, so make sure you all go out and really experience everything that Miami Book Fair has to offer. I'd like to also ask you to please consider becoming friends of the Book Fair. This year, we've made it much easier for you to join. Simply text 501-501, text book, to 501-501. They'll send you a reply text, and you can just confirm and become friends of the Book Fair. Part of the benefits of becoming friends of the Book Fair: preferential seating, early access to special events, and really it's just a way of contributing and ensuring that Miami Book Fair continues its success year after year as we've had for the past 32 years. At this time, I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Knight Foundation, OHL Arellano, and the Bachelor Foundation, and so many other sponsors and contributors who make this event a success year after year. I'd also like to let you know that Miami Book Fair does not end today. As a matter of fact, there are activities, programs, and events that continue all throughout the year. This is really just a culmination weekend, but there are Miami Book Fair activities throughout the year, so I'd ask you to continue your support and continue to come out and support that. There's going to be a brief Q&A session following the author discussion. If you basically proceed right out these doors that you walked in through, make it right, there's going to be a table where you can purchase books, and then a little bit further down, there's going to be an area for you to get your books autographed. I'd also like to take a moment to thank all the volunteers. You see them here in their black shirts. Without their help, this event really would not be possible. I'd like to now finally take a moment and just ask everyone to either silence or put your phones on vibrate, just so there will be no interruptions. And now to introduce our authors is Ms. Libby Gadinsky. Thank you.
So I've been asked to give my title. So I don't have a title. So I came up with one. I'm the self-appointed president of the Andrew Solomon Fan Club. So it gives me particular pleasure to introduce today's session. Actually, Andrew and I met on the board of directors of the National LGBTQ Task Force. So Andrew Solomon is a professor of psychology at Columbia University and a regular contributor to The New Yorker, NPR, and the New York Times Magazine. His TED Talks have been listened to more than 11 million times. I personally am responsible for at least a dozen of those times. He is the author of Far and Away, Places on the Brink of Change, 7 Continents, 25 Years. That will be coming out, I think, in the spring. He is the National Book Critics Circle Award winner for Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity. Also the author of The Irony Tower, Soviet Artists in the Time of Glasnost. Andrew has also written a novel, A Stone Boat. I highly recommend it. And we are here today to hear him speak from The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression. It won the 2001 National Book Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. With uncommon humanity, candor, wit, and erudition, The Noonday Demon examines depression in personal, cultural, and scientific terms. Drawing on his own struggles with the illness and interviews with fellow sufferers, doctors and scientists, policymakers and politicians, drug designers and philosophers, Andrew Solomon reveals the subtle complexities and sheer agony of the disease, as well as the reasons for hope. His work has transformed countless lives. I also have the pleasure of introducing Scott Stossel, the editor of The Atlantic, and the author of Sarge, The Life and Times of Sargent Shriver. His articles and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The New Republic, The New York Times, and many other publications. His most recent book, My Age of Anxiety, Fear, Hope, Dread, and the Search for Peace of Mind, has been named a Washington Post notable book and a Seattle Times Best Book of the Year. Drawing on his own long-standing battle with anxiety, Stossel presents a moving and revelatory account of a condition that affects some 40 million Americans. Revealing anxiety's myriad manifestations and the anguish it causes, he also surveys the countless psychotherapies, medications, and often outlandish treatments that have been developed to relieve it. I ask that you would join me in thanking them for the work that they've done that has been so transformative for all of us. So, which one of you wanted to go first? Oh, sorry. Then you get to choose when you're up here. So they're each going to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes and then switch into the Q&A session.
Let me begin by thanking you, Libby, and by saying how lovely it is to be in Miami. Often author events seem to be in less desirable locations than this one, so it's a joy to be here. I'm going to start with Emily Dickinson. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till I felt that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll as if the heavens were a bell and being were an ear, and I and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. Just then, a plank in reason broke, and I fell down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. There must be some reason why I memorized that poem when I was in 7th grade. There were a lot of others I could have chosen, but that one really, I think, is one of the best descriptions of the experience of acute depression that I've ever read. And though I didn't develop acute depression for many, many years, I must have known there was some foreshadowing of it. I am going to begin by describing a little bit about my own depression, but just for context, I'll say that my book, The Noonday Demon, was really an attempt on my part to look at depression as broadly as possible, to look into my own experience, which I had chronicled for The New Yorker before starting the book, to look at the experiences of other people, and to try to understand all of the different rhetoric that was used in describing or speaking about depression. Because it seemed to me, as I began to look for literature in the wake of my own experience, that there were a great many personal memoirs, there were scientific studies, there were anthropological commentaries, there was historic material, and yet, rather strangely, there was nothing that put it together, and I felt there was a kind of chaos in the kingdom. And as I immersed myself in the work of that book, I was also struck by a strange contradiction, which is that I found that some people had what sounded, as they described it, like unbelievably terrible and severe depression, but nonetheless had rather rich and rewarding lives, at least in the interstices between their depressive episodes. While other people had what sounded, as we spoke to one another, like much more mild depression, but were nonetheless completely disabled by it. And I wanted to understand what the mechanisms of that resilience were, and why some people were able to cope so much better than others. I'll start with my own experience, which is that I had really dealt with life, I think, fairly well and thought of myself as fairly resilient, though in retrospect I can see some minor signs early on. And then my mother died when I was in my late 20s, and a relationship that I thought might be for the long term came to an end. and a variety of other things seemed to go awry, and I coped with it all just fine. And then a few years later, I was publishing my novel, and it seemed to be doing well, and I had always wanted to publish a novel. And all of a sudden, I began to feel detached from what was happening to me. I just didn't find I cared very much whether I got a good review or a bad review or no review or what happened or who called. And then things began to seem difficult, and I would feel that everything seemed sort of strangely overwhelming. I would think, oh, I should get up and have a shower. And then I would think, but I would have to get into the bathroom, and I would have to turn on the water, and I would have to take off what I'm wearing, and I would have to get under it, and I would have to open the shampoo bottle. And it all sounded incredibly overwhelming all of a sudden. And one of the things that often gets lost from descriptions of depression is that you know it is idiotic even while you're experiencing it. You know that it's ridiculous that almost everyone gets up and takes a shower, and that they don't give it 5 minutes of thought, and that it isn't so difficult. And yet I found myself struggling with the most basic things. I would come in and I would listen to the messages on my answering machine, that being the answering machine era, and instead of thinking, oh, how great I heard from all those people, I would think, how can I ever call all those people back? I would feel so exhausted by the very prospect of it. And then the feeling of anxiety began to set in. Now, Scott's going to say a great deal more about anxiety than I am, but I will tell you that anxiety is part of most major depression, that it is a coexisting aspect of the condition. And I would say that if you told me I had to be depressed for the next month, I would probably be able to deal with it as long as I knew it was only for a month. Because while it's very painful, part of what's painful is the sense that you're never going to emerge from it, that this will be the only reality for the rest of your life. But if you said I had to have really acute anxiety for the next month, I would go out and try to drown myself in the ocean, because the idea of having to deal with that constant sense of pain would be so appalling to me. I've sometimes said it's like that instant if you slip and trip before you hit the ground, when you feel completely out of control, totally terrified, utterly helpless, but that lasts for about a second and a half. And this lasted hour after hour, day after day, month after month, and it was intolerable. I was completely terrified, but I couldn't tell what it was that I was so afraid of. I could only tell how frightened I was. And I finally woke up one day, and I thought I might even have had a stroke, because I looked at the phone next to my bed and thought I should call for help, and I couldn't move. I couldn't get my arm to lift up and pick up the phone. And I lay there staring at that phone for 5 hours. And at the end of 5 hours, it rang. And fortunately, it was my father. And fortunately, I managed to answer it. And I said, something has gone very wrong. Can you come down here? And that was when I began looking at treatment for depression. I emerged through a mixture of psychotherapy and medication. And as soon as I emerged, I thought, well, I'm done with that. And so I stopped doing the psychotherapy and medication. And then I had a relapse, and then I emerged, and then I had a relapse, and then I emerged. And so it went, as it seems to go for almost everyone who's dealing with this, because the idea that suddenly your ability to cope with the world has been taken away from you is such a foreign and such an alien idea. It's so distressing, and it results in a crisis of identity. I found myself thinking, but who am I? Are these medications helping me to be myself? Or are they somehow turning me into someone else? And if they've turned me into someone else, is that an okay thing to do? Or is that cheating somehow? Is that wrong somehow? Am I giving up far more than I would ever have intended? And it took a long time for me to understand, A, that I was going to require treatment over the long term, and B, that this dichotomy that we're all acquainted with, in which we say, but is this my personality or is this my brain chemistry, is a false divide. Because in fact, one's brain chemistry and one's experience are endlessly intertwined. And if many of the people in this room have college educations, someday when scanning gets good enough, we'll be able to see where those reside because they've changed you. And if anyone in this room has had a real disruption of their interior biochemistry, then the people who have dealt with that disruption will also have had it manifest in ways that they feel and in ways that they act. So it's two vocabularies for a single problem. And our understanding of the brain should never preclude our understanding of thought and our understanding of experience. I feel very grateful that I live now and not 50 years ago, because the interventions that have saved me weren't available 50 years ago. And I really think that if I had lived then, I wouldn't be someone who can stand up on a stage and talk to you about these experiences. But at the same time, I feel really sad to think of how these treatments will be seen 50 years from now. And my hope is that people then will say, how could anyone have endured those crude interventions? Because the medications have a lot of side effects. The psychotherapy is incredibly time-consuming. The whole process of dealing with this is exhausting. And yet in some ways, it can also be very meaningful. Now, I often say that the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And it's vitality that I really most specifically lacked through the periods of my own depression, and that I lack on the occasions when it recurs. And people sometimes ask whether it isn't grief in part, because it came not so long after sad events in my life. Grief and depression can look very similar for a while, but grief essentially begins to modulate and to be reduced over the time after a great loss, and depression tends to escalate. So if you lost someone and a year later you feel really sad but you're coping with life a little bit better, it was probably grief, and even if it's slow to resolve, it will eventually reach the point at which you can handle it. But if you had a terrible loss and a year later you can barely function and you're doing a lot worse than you were then, it's probably a depression that was triggered by grief, but the two are wound together. So I went off and talked to people who had dealt with the experience of depression, and I won't go into very many of them, but I'll give you a couple of things that people said to me in talking about it. One of the people I talked to was someone named Maggie Robbins, who had had very acute clinical depression as part of bipolar illness. She was the first person I ever knew who got depressed. It was while we were in college. And then she did pretty well for some years on lithium. And then she was seeing a doctor who said to her, well, you've done so well on lithium, why don't you try going off it? Bipolar illness does not go away. Bipolar illness can be controlled, it can be dealt with, but it does not go away. And she went into a psychotic manic episode and then into a depression so deep that she could barely move. I remember going up to see her, and she couldn't talk, and she couldn't move, and she just sat there. And when I asked her about it, she said, I would lie in bed all the time trying to blot out the things my mind was saying to me, which were, you are nobody. You don't even deserve to live. You are worthless. And that was when I started thinking about killing myself. And then she said, you don't believe in depression, that you've put on a veil and are seeing the world through the haze of a bad mood. You think the veil has been lifted, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly. It's easy to exorcise the demons of schizophrenics who perceive that there's something foreign inside of them. But it's much harder with depressives because we believe we are seeing the truth. But the truth lies. And I want to examine that notion of a truth that lies. People who are depressed are quite likely to say things that are not true. They say, nobody really loves me. And you can say, of course people love you. Your mother loves you, your wife loves you, your children love you, I love you, all kinds of responses to that. But people who are depressed also say things that are true. They say, no matter what happens, in the end we're all just going to die. Or they say, no matter what, Each of us is trapped in our own body, and there's no true communion with another human being. And you, as the person helping to take care of someone with depression, have to say, that's true, but why don't we focus on what to have for lunch right now? And it's a sort of constant struggle. Now, this perception that depressed people have that they're seeing the truth, and our perception that the truths are true, but the response to those truths in the sense that they mean all of life is worthless is wrong, is actually borne out by science. There is a study that I'm particularly attached to, now quite an old study, in which a group of depressed and a group of non-depressed people were asked to play a video game for about 20 minutes, no, for an hour. And at the end of the hour, they were asked how many little monsters they thought they had killed. And the depressed people were mostly accurate to within 10%. And the non-depressed people guessed between 15 and 20 times as many little monsters as they had killed. And so there is a lot of truth in the experience of depression, but it's not a useful truth. And a life that is based completely in truth is not necessarily a very high-functioning life. Now, I started off this work thinking that there were really essentially two means, or three means rather, of treating depression. There were medications, there were certain proved forms of psychotherapy, talk therapy, and there was electroshock treatment. And then I got deeper and deeper into this world, and I came to revise that point of view, because I realized that if you have brain cancer and you say it makes you feel better to stand on your head for 20 minutes every morning, you may feel better, but you still probably have brain cancer, and you're still probably going to die from it if you don't do anything else. But if you have depression, and you say it makes you feel better to stand on your head for 20 minutes every morning, then it's worked, because depression is an illness of how you feel. And if you feel better, you're not depressed anymore. So I sort of opened up with time to a whole variety of alternative treatments, and I got then, and I continue to get, floods and floods of letters from people writing to tell me about what's worked for them. And I am particularly attached to the woman who wrote to me and said that she had tried psychotherapy, she had tried medication, she had tried all these things, and she had found the thing that worked for her, and she wanted me to tell the world about it, and that was making little things from yarn, some of which she sent to me, and none of which I am wearing right now. But it was quite an intense experience. And I then went off to look at a variety of alternatives. And there was a young man I met who was in the midst of arranging to have an invasive brain surgery for something called a cingulotomy. The area of surgery for depression has expanded enormously in more recent years. And in the newly revised edition of this book that has just come out and will be for sale outside, I've talked about Helen Mayberg's work in which she uses deep brain stimulation and has brought about extraordinary remissions from acute depression. But Frank Russakoff, in any event, had had such severe depression that he had been more or less unable to function for a decade. He had been fine growing up. He had gone to Northwestern, he was on the soccer team, and then one day he felt such a strong desire to kill himself that he got into the car, drove away from the theater where he'd been seeing a movie, and checked himself into a hospital. And in the end, the only thing that seemed to work for him was electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, electroshock treatments. He was also on a boatload of medication. He would go and have an ECT treatment. He would be disoriented afterwards, as people mostly are, for about a week. He would have a week of feeling okay. He would have a week of going downhill, and then he would go back to have another treatment. And he was pale, and he was thin, and he was drawn. And then he told me he was going to try the cingulotomy protocol. And I thought, what is the optimism buried deep inside someone that allows him to choose to look for something else that will work when nothing has worked so far? Where does that little sliver of hope from the bottom of Pandora's box come from in someone who has had only adverse experiences for this length of time? Well, he had the surgery, and when he came out of the surgery, he began to get better, and he's now doing extremely well. He said to me that he had had a present from his father from the Sharper Image for Christmas, but they also had from his family a portrait of his grandmother who committed suicide. And he too talked about how we live in the right time and how much it meant to him to live in the right time. I'll wrap up by talking about the answer to that question I started with, which was the question of resilience. How is it that some people manage to be resilient and others not? What I found is that the people who think I've had a depression, it was a horrific experience, I need to get it out to the very margins of my consciousness, those people who are trying not to think about it ever again are the ones who tend to be most haunted by it. And the people who have had a depression and who have tried to look at it and say, I wouldn't have chosen this, but there was a certain amount to be gained from it, those are the people who are in fact trying to build somehow a life that incorporates their experience of depression, and who can say over time, not that I won't have another depressive episode, but that if I do, it won't disrupt my essential sense of character and who I am. So Frank Russakoff said, there really are upsides to depression. I don't want to have it again, but I've learned so much and become a kinder person because of it. And Maggie Robbins, who I quoted to you, said, I've learned to give all the things that I need. She said, and it's made me better able to be there for people unintrusively when they need me. So I look at my own experience of depression. I'm quite fond of the depression in my past. I am not at all fond of the idea that there might be more depression in my future. And there probably will be, because it is cyclical and I've dealt with it before. But I think that once you've been depressed, you get a different kind of appreciation for the part of life that when you aren't depressed, and that each day when you wake up and you feel okay, you have a wave of enormous gratitude that is connected to that experience. For myself, I think about it. I think how I could have killed myself and how I kept going. I think how much more empathy I've been able to achieve for people who are struggling with conditions in which their minds distort their point of view. I've written more recently about people who commit crimes, and I've thought, sometimes you're helpless in the grip of your mind. Not always, but sometimes you are. And having been through that depression, I have a vivid, rich sense of having somehow managed to find enough coherence to choose to stay alive despite whatever the challenges were. And that has turned out to be a deeply privileged rapture. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you to the Miami Book Fair, and thank you especially to Andrew. I think this is maybe the third, or if not the fourth time I've shared a stage with Andrew, and his book, The Noonday Demon, was kind of the inspiration and the model for me in writing my book about anxiety, and the kind of grace and depth of intellectual exploration and the sort of humanity that he brought to it was what I aspired to. And honestly, I don't think I could have written my book without having read his book beforehand. So, you know. So with that said, let me say that I have to say there's a certain irony to my standing in front of you here on stage today. You know, I'm here because I've written a book about that is in part, you know, this is part about my terror of, among other things, public speaking. And yet here I am, my reward, as it were, for having written such a book, that I get to stand up here and to do more public speaking. And my fear of public appearances historically is severe and long-standing enough that, as I talk in my book about an episode where when I was about 15 years old, I won second place in a tennis tournament, and I literally, you know, there was an awards banquet, and I'm sitting there, you know, waiting to be announced so I can go up and win the under 14, you know, runner-up prize, And the fear of having to go up, and all I had to do was walk up on stage, shake hands, collect the prize, and walk off. That was so acutely anxiety-provoking to me that I ran down, when they got to about the 12-year-olds, ran down to the basement and hid in the bathroom for several hours, rather than to actually have to accept the award on stage. So this is kind of where I come from. But when I completed a draft of this book, one of my early readers wrote me an email saying, you've written a very brave book, and you're going to get a lot of people saying that it's very brave. And he was right, but I find that to be kind of a perverse thing, because the only thing I've been brave about is admitting my lack of bravery, or the depth of my lack of courage. And so when I hear people telling me my book is brave, what I hear in my mind is, boy, you are stupid. The implication being that what I'm choosing to do is what most people would have the common sense not to, which is to reveal my disorder, my frailties and vulnerabilities and most embarrassing moments to the world. So I'll get back to that in a bit. But anyway, when my book came out in winter of 2014, a friend of mine who's also written about his personal struggles with mental health issues said that he thought that what made the book work was that it combined a kind of radical subjectivity, which is to say, me trying to convey the experience of what it can be like to live in my own anxious mind, with a kind of clinical distance. And again, I, stole this from Andrew, but treating myself and the topic of anxiety more generally with a kind of clinical objectivity and historical perspective. And so in the book, the book is a mixture of the kind of cultural and historical history of the idea of anxiety with memoir. And I didn't set out in the book to be nearly so self-revealing as I was. I knew that I wanted to engage non-academic, non-specialist readers. And if I needed to do that, I wanted to inflect the book with a little bit of my own personal experiences. But I didn't set out to write a memoir. My intention was really to have the book be more about history and science. So, and the truth is, in the end, if you measure the kind of quantity of words that are about, their general exposition about the history and science of anxiety, or the anxiety versus what's about me, the by far the majority is about the former. But what most people respond to, and the way the book ended up being received, was much more as a memoir about anxiety, which I suppose shouldn't be surprising. It is called, after all, My Age of Anxiety. And actually, my original proposed title for the book was The Anatomy of Anxiety, which I wanted to evoke the Robert Burton classic work from the 17th century called The Anatomy of Melancholy, which, along with Andrew's book, were the sort of two models for what I wanted to do. And my agent, who I think may be your agent as well, he's very terrifying and intimidating. And he said, Scott, he's not actually British, but he speaks with a kind of vague British accent. He said, Scott, no, you will call it My Age of Anxiety. And he was right. So I actually published an excerpt of the book before it came out in The Atlantic, where I'm the editor of the magazine. And if the book is the distillation of my anxiety and my sometime craziness, the excerpt, which my colleagues carved out of the book, is sort of the florid distillation of that distillation. It's the full crazy, as I say, with all of my phobias and anxieties and myriad disorders and idiosyncratic behaviors out there on display for the 500,000 Atlantic subscribers and however million readers we have online. And the truth is, I could never have sat down to write that article as it appeared, knowing that it would appear that way. As I talk about in the book, I'm half kind of, on my mother's side, on my father's side, histrionic demonstrative Jew, and on my mother's side, half repressed WASP. So as I say in the book, I'm sort of half Woody Allen. I'm like Woody Allen trapped in John Calvin. And so in matters of emotional expression, the WASP side often prevails. But what happened was that when the book came out, and I have to say, as I was working on the book, Andrew, my agent, and my psychotherapist at the time was saying, put more of yourself into the book. This is what people are going to relate to. So I did, but kind of largely convinced that no one would ever actually read it. And partly that was because I was late with the book. It was years overdue. The economy crashed. The publishing industry was in disarray. And so I figured, well, I'll just sort of write this, and no one will ever read it. But then suddenly the book was done, and it was about to come out, and in a certain way, having the Atlantic excerpt come out before the book did was kind of a good thing, because it was being the distillation of the crazy. It ripped the Band-Aid off. I'd spent years hiding my anxiety from everyone but my closest family members. I was afraid when the book came out, I'd be humiliated or rejected or doomed to professional unemployability. And it came out, and the world didn't end. Coworkers came up to offer me hugs, which I found sweet but very awkward. And to say they had no idea about how anxious I was, which made me realize how good I had been at hiding it. At one point, our copy editor came to me and said, "Do I need to laugh at your stupid jokes in editorial meetings in order to make you?" And I said, "No, just be the same. No, please treat me the same. I don't want pity. I don't want anyone to treat me anyone the way I have before." But anyway, I thought it might be useful to talk about how I came to write the book, and about what the experience of publishing it has been like, and what the response has been like from both anxiety sufferers, clinicians, and researchers. So the truth is, the idea, I've suffered from anxiety my whole life, but I was getting ready for the publication of my first book about 10 years ago now, which was a biography of Sergeant Shriver, who was the founder of the Peace Corps. And the prospect of that was so terrifying to me. I was seized by terrible anxiety about the book tour that publication would entail. There were going to be live TV and radio appearances. I was going to have to make public appearances in front of rather large audiences, much like this one. And I was frankly terrified. And honestly, like my just an anecdote, my dread of what was coming was so intense that I actually went with a friend to see the movie, of all things, Mean Girls, which was the movie with what's her name, Lindsay Lohan, and there was a scene where Tim Meadows, who plays the principal of the school, has to give a talk. And seeing him up there in front of all these high school students having to give a talk gave me such an intense panic attack. I had to run out of the theater. And my friend was like, what is wrong with you? So I was thinking, oh my God, how am I possibly going to get through this? So I was 34 at the time, and I'd been in psychotherapy, and had medicated for 20 years at that point. But I was desperate. So, and I will quote a little bit from my book here. But in desperation, I sought help from multiple sources. I first went to a prominent Harvard psychopharmacologist who had been recommended by my principal psychiatrist a year earlier. And he said, "You have an anxiety disorder. Fortunately, this is highly treatable. We just need to get you properly medicated." So when I gave him my standard objections to reliance on medication, my worry about side effects, concerns about drug dependency, discomfort with the idea of taking pills that might affect my mind or change who I am, he resorted to the cliched but nonetheless very potent argument, the diabetes argument, which goes like this. Look, your anxiety has a biological, physiological, medical, genetic basis. It's a medical illness, just like diabetes is. If you were diabetic, you wouldn't have such qualms about taking insulin, would you? And you wouldn't see your diabetes as a moral failing, the way I saw my anxiety, would you? And so I had many, in the past I had many conversations with various psychiatrists about this, and I tried to resist whatever the latest drug was, and feeling this resistance was somehow noble or moral. But ultimately, inevitably, my anxiety would become so acute that I would be willing to try anything that would go on whatever the latest medication was. So in this case, as usual, I capitulated, and as the book tour loomed, I started a course of benzodiazepines, which was Xanax during the day and Klonop at night, and elevated my dosage of Celexa, which was the SSRI antidepressant I was taking already. But even relatively drugged to the gills at that point, I was still filled with terror about the impending book tour. It felt like I could have a catastrophic failure that would ruin my life, my career. So I went to the nationally renowned Center for Anxiety Disorders at Boston University, which specializes in what's known as cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is kind of the cutting edge treatment of choice for both depression and anxiety, among other disorders. So I got evaluated there and got referred to a very highly trained, very well respected Stanford trained psychologist. And she said, so I go to meet with her. I liked her a lot. And she said, first thing we've got to do is get you off your drugs. So a few sessions later, she actually offered to take my Xanax from me, and she actually opened a drawer in her desk and took out all the Xanax that all of her other patients had given her and shook them for effect. She said, these drugs are a crutch that's preventing you from truly experiencing your anxiety and thereby confronting it. And if you can't experience the raw experience of anxiety, you'll never be able to cope with it on your own. And I knew at some level she was right. Exposure therapy is based on fully experiencing your anxiety, which is hard to do if you're taking anti-anxiety medications. But my fear was, with the book tour looming, it's all well and good to try to experience it, but what if I'm on like live TV and I couldn't handle it, and I, made an ass of myself on live TV? So I went back to the Harvard psychopharmacologist, who was the one who had prescribed the drugs, and I'll call him Dr. Harvard here, and described the course of action that the Stanford psychologist, let's call her Dr. Stanford, had proposed. And he said, look, it's your call. You could try giving up the medication, but your anxiety is clearly so deep-rooted in your biology that even mild stress provokes it. Only medication can control your biological reaction. And it may well be that your anxiety is so acute that the only way to be able to get to the point where any kind of behavioral therapy can begin to be effective is by taking the edge off your physical symptoms by taking drugs. So I said, well, what if I get addicted to Xanax and have to be on it all my life? And I had done enough research to know that benzodiazepines can be notoriously dependency-inducing, and that too sudden withdrawal can induce horrific side effects. And he said, so what if you do? I have a patient coming in this afternoon who's been taking it for 20 years. She couldn't live without it. So at my next session with Dr. Stanford, which was the next day, I told her I was afraid to give up my Xanax and related what Dr. Harvard had told to me. And she honestly looked betrayed, and I thought for a moment that she might cry. So after that, I stopped telling her about my visits to Dr. Harvard. They sort of felt illicit, like I was cheating on my cognitive behavioral therapist with my psychopharmacologist. And I have to say, Dr. Stanford was more likable and more pleasant to talk to than Dr. Harvard. She tried to understand what caused my anxiety, and she seemed to care about me as an individual personality. Dr. Harvard, on the other hand, seemed to see me as a type, an anxiety patient to be treated with a one-size-fits-all solution, which was, in his case, drugs. And some months later, so I actually happened to read in my local newspaper, the Boston Globe, that Dr. Harvard was actually treating a depressed gorilla in the local zoo. And I noted with great interest that the treatment that Dr. Harvard had doled out to the gorilla was the very same one he'd given to me. It was Celexa, the SSRI he was prescribing for me. So I can't say for certain whether the drug worked for the gorilla, although I've read that it did. But could there be a more potent demonstration that Dr. Harvard's approach to treatment was, resolutely biological? For him, the content of any psychic distress, and certainly the meaning of it, mattered less than the fact of it. Such distress, whether in a human or some other primate, like I feel a certain kinship with this depressed gorilla, was a medical biological malfunction that could be fixed with drugs. So what to do? On the one hand, Dr. Harvard was telling me that I, like the gorilla, had a medical problem in need of pharmaceutical intervention. On the other hand, Dr. Stanford was telling me that my problem was not principally biological, but rather cognitive. If I could simply correct dysfunctions in how I thought through force of will and cognitive reframing and direct exposure to my greatest fears, then my anxiety would be reduced. But Dr. Stanford said the drugs I was on were impeding my ability to address those dysfunctions in an effective way. So I kept trying to give up the Klonopin and the Xanax in order to do proper cognitive retraining, and would sometimes even succeed in this in small ways. Only ultimately, most of the time, to be overwhelmed again with anxiety and to resort miserably to panically fumbling through my pockets for the Xanax. And as much as I would have liked to have cured myself through fixing my thinking or achieving spiritual peace or simply learning to cope, I seemed always to be ending up like the depressed gorilla, in need of artificial adjustments to my neurotransmitters to fix my anxious, broken brain. So the discrepancy between how these two very well-meaning and well-trained therapists approach my anxiety fascinated me, and this is where I began to realize maybe there's a book in this, and that my own case study could serve as a jumping-off point for explorations into the theories of and treatments of anxiety. And as I say in the book, I am not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a sociologist, historian of science, but I unfortunately am rather an authority on my own experience of anxiety, which I try to convey in the book, and combine that with research and reporting that I hoped would provide a rich intellectual exploration that considered anxiety from multiple levels: medical, biological, psychological, spiritual, cultural perspective. And when the book came out, this was now in hardcover in January of 2014, there was a review in the New Yorker and by Louis Menand, who's one of my hero writers. So I was incredibly honored to be reviewed by him. But one of his most sharp critiques, or one of his sharpest critiques, was like, Stossel can't make up his mind. Like, is anxiety a medical problem or a psychological problem or a spiritual problem or a cultural condition? Pick one. And I was frustrated with that because my whole point was that you can't. I mean, I think the medical model is the most scientific way to approach this and maybe the most effective in designing treatments and helping to reduce stigma. But I do think that anxiety exists, on all of these dimensions simultaneously. So let me just talk briefly, and then I'll wrap up, about the sort of response to the book. The reception of the book fell into sort of a few categories. One is, you are completely nuts. Several of my friends who do not suffer from clinical anxiety, but maybe are on the kind of anxious end of the temperamental spectrum, said the book made them feel actually really good. Because on the one hand, they could relate to certain aspects of my anxiety, but mainly they just felt, boy, I just feel blessed not to be messed up as he is. The second group was family members of people with anxiety disorders who said this book helped them understand what their wife / husband / son, daughter, whatever was going through. Actually, when I was in 5th grade, I was the opposite of a precocious kid. But I had a huge crush in 5th grade on a 6th grader who was a year ahead of me. And we had this long-standing, unconsummated relationship that was based basically on riding the bus together, and we'd play games and stuff. And I hadn't heard from her for 30 years. And she wrote back, when the book came out, she wrote to me, and she turns out she's now a psychologist in Oakland, and she said, your book is fantastic. I now actually prescribe it to family members of my patients to understand what anxiety was. She also said that until she got married, I was the romantic ideal. She measured all her boyfriends again. Now, I was 10 years old, so I don't. Anyway, so and then I've had several psychotherapists say that psychotherapists say that their patients thrust the book on them, saying read this. This is what I've been telling you about. This is what it's like. And I have a lot of people saying the book made them feel better in ways that I confess I don't truthfully fully understand, because I'm not cured of my anxiety. I'm medicated up as I stand here talking to you, and I don't have very concrete advice about how other people can feel less anxious. But somehow I guess people's recognizing their own experiences in my own have made them feel less alone. And so that gives me great pleasure. On the other hand, I've also had other people say that reading my book made them feel very, very anxious, and so I feel like the book should come probably with an FDA warning and maybe a Xanax prescription. I don't know. And then the third category of people was, I literally had hundreds of people writing to me to say, I used to suffer from everything that you talk about, but you're not really committed to getting better unless you do what I did, because I'm totally better. And so here's just a partial list of the recommendations that I got for how to relieve my anxiety. And the most common was, dude, why don't you just smoke pot? Cut out caffeine, cut out gluten, cut out refined sugar, cut out grains, dairy, wheat, take pharmaceutical-grade probiotics, take vitamin B supplements, take vitamin D supplements. I do that. Take magnesium supplements, take fish oil, get treated for hypoglycemia, undergo attachment therapy, take ketamine, take beta blockers, get regular exercise, do yoga, do mindfulness meditation, practice daily gratitude exercises, take LSD, take ayahuasca, try traditional Chinese medicine, get more sunlight, get surgery on your eyes, try hypnotism, do deep breathing, read Essential Spirituality by Roger Walsh, read The Denial of Death by Ernst Becker, read the collected works of Claire Weeks, in particular Hope and Help for Your Nerves or Peace from Nervous Suffering. Try Toastmasters, put your faith in God. Try neurofeedback. Try transcranial magnetic stimulation. Do meridian tapping or emotional freedom technique. deep psychoanalysis to deal with your clear rage against your mother, intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy, and get a fucking grip. All of which I will concede have some merit to them, and many of which have actually tried. I have to say my favorite response, a couple weeks after the book came out, I woke up one morning, I was scrolling through Twitter, and Paulina Porcikova, who was a supermodel in the 1980s, tweeted me and said, "Oh, I wish you'd published your book 30 years earlier because it would have been really helpful." And I was like, this must be a hoax. It can't be the real Paulina Porcikova. So I wrote back to her on Twitter, and she wrote back to me, and it turns out it was the real Paulina Porcikova. And so I told her, I was like, if I could have known when I was 14 years old and ravaged by anxiety that, 30 years later, the woman on the cover of my Sports Illustrated would write me a book, or write me a note saying how helpful my book had been, that probably would have cured my anxiety forever. So anyway, I'll wrap up. I'm still anxious, but I do think that the experience of publishing the book and coming out of as anxious has been moderately therapeutic. It was sort of the succeeding in publishing the book was a demonstration of self-efficacy and accomplishment. And in some ways, the pressure is off. I was always afraid of having to reveal my anxiety. I kept it hidden to a degree that a successful degree that I hadn't realized. And in the past, if I had to run off stage, it was acutely embarrassing. And not, if I ran off stage now, it wouldn't be acutely embarrassing. But if I ran off stage now, I'd just say, please refer to chapter 9, and you would understand. So there's a lot that I haven't covered here. I talk about the history going back, a couple thousand years about our evolving understanding of anxiety. My research into the genetic factors underlying anxiety. Whole bunch of other stuff, the complicated relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance companies and the psychiatric establishment, the role of culture and politics and social structures in engendering and or mitigating anxiety across history. But I will stop here and thank you all for coming out to listen to us, and thank you very much for coming.
Just like to say thank you again to our authors. At this time, we probably only have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, but immediately after following the session, you can meet the authors outside. There's going to be a book signing table, and you'll have more opportunities to ask more questions. So I know there are a few people lined up. We may only be able to get to a few of you, so you can go ahead, sir.
Thank you both. I'm hoping for your comments on the following ideas or thoughts and how it relates. First, sorry.
So,
is it working? Thank you. I'm hoping for your comments on the following general ideas. The relationship of either to OCD, to vacillation, and the anxiety one experiences in making decisions and feeling that either one is wrong, to the experience of guilt. So, for example, a child of divorcing parents who thinks, I'm responsible, and in the context of the children of Holocaust survivors. Any of all of that?
That's a rather sweeping set of questions altogether. There's no question that OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, is related. I think there's increasing evidence that, in fact, many different mental disorders are essentially related, and that the underlying neurobiology is going to break down a lot of the boundaries that were set up by collecting groups of symptoms and describing the conditions on a syndromal basis. Children's guilt about their parents and so on seems to me to be another area. I think I would just say altogether that this sense of disordered thinking, which is self-critical, or this sense of anxiety which can be reduced only by ritualistic behavior, that those things I think are tied to both depression and anxiety.
Yeah, just 2 quick points. One, you know, in the DSM-5, they moved OCD actually out of the anxiety disorders category, and my own psychotherapist says that he thinks that completely wrong because all of his OCD patients, even though you know, they've sort of moved it into the kind of spectrum of, you know, compulsive disorders, he says they're all anxious. The other thing is it's the research on descendants of Holocaust survivors is fascinating, and that even the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have elevated levels of anxiety and will react more acutely to images of trauma, even if it has nothing to do with the Holocaust. So it's almost like experience of, you know, acute trauma like that, and certainly something like the Holocaust almost gets plastered into your physiology, and then transmitted down through the generations. So,
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more brief question. Go ahead.
This working. Yeah, I think that so much of this is, in this talk and elsewhere, is based on what individuals who are suffering from things can do, and I think the real issue is the rest of society, to be honest with you. Speaking for myself and other people who I've been close to over the years, lots of times I've had depression most of my life because I've been authentically true to myself, and I've refused to give in to being less so that I could be more popular, to being less intelligent, less kind, and so forth. And I think sometimes people get over their problems because they give in. And I think often people who don't get over their problems don't give in. They insist on being true to themselves. And there's a value in authenticity. And I think what we should really do is concentrate on how we can make the world a better, kinder place, and less on kind of blaming the victim, my point of view.
I think there's no question that all of these disorders are related to experience, and that experience is essentially social. And I think there are many ways in which modernity is incredibly alienating. I get many letters from people who spend all day working in front of a machine of some kind in a factory or with a computer. They pick up something to eat on their way home, and then they eat it sitting in front of a television screen and have almost no human contact. I think there is no question that there are struggles that are associated with our time. I believe it would be great if we could change those, but I think that is a very long-term project, and I don't see a contradiction between doing that and having people attempt in the current moment to live lives in which they experience a reasonable amount of joy. And I think that what treating depression does is it allows you not to be anxious about collecting a trophy on stage, not to be so depressed that you can't get into the shower, but rather to be at the point at which you can be upset about the recent events in Paris, about what's happening in the presidential elections, about how to build a better world. And that if we ignore the depression and anxiety that are experienced by individual people in the name of a larger social agenda, we leave those people themselves bereft. And life is short. And if you spend the year that you're 35 in an acute, terrible depression that could have achieved remission, you will never get that year of being 35 back again. It's gone once and for all. So I think the social and the personal are both urgent and both need to be addressed.
what he said.
All right, well, thank you again. Please, everyone, put your hands together for our wonderful authors, and again, meet them right outside. Thank you.